The cattle drive began before the sun came up, not because anyone particularly wanted to be awake at 4 in the morning, but because the cattle did not care about anyone's preferences, and because the work of moving 3,000 longhorns across 500 miles of open country operated on a schedule determined entirely by the animals and the land, not by the men responsible for getting them there. Between 1865 and 1895, approximately 10 million cattle were driven north from Texas to railheads in Kansas, along the Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail. The cowboy has been elevated into mythology. Solitary, tough, free, living a life of clean, open air and simple, honest work under the wide sky of the American West. The open air was genuinely there. The wide sky was real. The freedom, within very specific limits, existed. What the mythology omits is the smell, and the dust, and the rain that soaked through everything, and the days that went 18 hours before ending in 2 hours of night herd and a few hours on the ground before the cycle started again. This video is about how cowboys actually lived on a 3-month cattle drive, the daily reality behind the mythology, examined honestly and in full. Let's start with the crew and the structure of a cattle drive, because the organization of the drive determined every aspect of daily life aboard it. A trail drive of 2,000 to 3,000 cattle, a standard-sized herd for the major drives, required a crew of approximately 10 to 12 cowboys, plus a trail boss, a cook, and sometimes a wrangler whose specific responsibility was managing the remuda, the string of spare horses that kept the operation moving. The trail boss was the operational commander, responsible for every decision about route, pace, water, emergencies, and crew. His salary, roughly $100 per month, was significantly higher than the cowboys under him, who typically earned $25 to $40 for a month of work with no defined end to the day. The cowboys were, by modern standards, remarkably young, median age in the early 20s, many still teenagers. The qualities that made a good trail cowboy, stamina, horsemanship, functioning at high performance on minimal sleep and irregular food, were qualities that younger bodies sustained more reliably. Civil War veterans were well represented in the early years. Later, the crews were predominantly men who had known no other work. Cattle drive crews were significantly more diverse than the mythology suggests. Historians estimate roughly 1/3 of all trail cowboys were black or Mexican. Many black cowboys were formerly enslaved men who had acquired their skills in forced labor and found in the cattle drive era a labor market where skill was valued more consistently than in most of the postbellum economy. Mexican vaqueros brought centuries of cattle handling technique and most of the fundamental equipment and vocabulary of cowboy work, including the lasso, the chaps, and the saddle design. The cattle drive had a rhythm as relentless as any military operation, and that rhythm was the container in which everything else happened. The day began between 3 and 4 in the morning. The cook was always up first, building the fire and preparing breakfast. Night herd riders came in at the end of their watch and either ate immediately or rolled out their blankets for a final hour of sleep. By sunrise, the herd was moving. 3,000 longhorns organized into a rough column stretching a mile or more. Led cattle moved at the front, the majority filled the middle, and the weaker animals moved at the drag, the rear, where the dust was thickest and the work was most miserable. The positions within the drive had a hierarchy understood by everyone. Swing riders flanked the front, flank riders worked the middle, and drag riders, the least experienced, ate the dust of 3,000 animals for 8 to 10 hours a day. Drag was universally the worst assignment, given to those who hadn't yet earned anything better. The herd moved approximately 10 to 15 miles per day when conditions were favorable. A pace that seemed slow by any motorized standard, but that was calibrated to the biology of the cattle. Enough movement to cover ground, slow enough to prevent weight loss that would reduce the value of the animals at their destination. The financial model was simple. Buy cheap in Texas, sell dear in Kansas. Every pound of body weight lost on the trail was money lost at the railhead. The pace was a financial calculation as much as a logistical one. Water was the organizing principle of the route. The trail boss planned each day around available sources, rivers, creeks, springs, improvised water holes on maps of varying reliability. When water was abundant, the drive moved comfortably. When scarce, as it often was in the dry country of West Texas and Kansas, the days grew longer and harder, and the cattle grew difficult to manage. River crossings were their own challenge. Cattle in water are not well behaved. They mill, balk, turn back into the current. A crossing with 3,000 cattle could take a full day or longer. The drowning of cattle, and occasionally of cowboys, was a genuine operational risk that every trail boss planned for and every cowboy feared. The sleep of a cattle drive cowboy was not the sleep of a man with a defined end to his working day and a private space to rest in. The bedroll was the cowboy's primary personal equipment and shelter. A heavy waxed canvas tarpaulin folded around 2 or 3 wool blankets, rolled tight, tied, and lashed to the supply wagon for travel. At the end of the day, it was spread wherever the ground offered the most acceptable sleeping surface. The word acceptable is doing significant work in that sentence. The ground on a cattle drive was not usually flat, not usually soft, not usually free of rocks or roots or the debris of 3,000 cattle passing through. The cowboys slept where the days and left him. In good conditions, on a dry night with mild temperatures, a blanket on the prairie was not a brutal experience. The exhaustion of a 12-hour day on horseback was sufficient anesthetic to make almost any surface comfortable. In bad conditions, which came regularly, the experience was considerably worse. Rain was the central weather threat. The tarpaulin provided some protection from ground moisture, but none from rain falling from above. The cowboy who got caught in rain got wet. Well, blankets, wet, were heavy, cold, and slow to dry. Clothing, wet, was chafing and miserable. Boots, wet, produced blisters that persisted for days of riding. Spring drives moved through the unpredictable transition weather of the southern plains. Cold nights alternated with warm days. Rain came without warning. Hailstorms crossed the open country with nothing to slow them. Lightning, terrifying to both cattle and horses, capable of triggering a nighttime stampede, was a constant threat during thunderstorm season. The cowboy on night herd duty did not sleep. Night herd was a watch responsibility. 2 riders circling the bedded herd in opposite directions throughout the night, singing or talking quietly to keep the cattle calm and aware of the human presence. Singing on night herd was not a romantic affectation. Cattle, startled silently, were cattle about to run. Cattle who heard consistent human presence throughout the night were calmer and harder to stampede. The songs were both communication and calming mechanism. The night herd rotation divided the night into 2-hour shifts. On the nights he was not on night herd, the cowboys slept 5 to 6 hours at most, because breakfast was underway by 3 in the morning and the trail moved at sunrise. There was no sleeping in on a cattle drive. The cumulative sleep debt of a 3-month drive was real and significant, a bone-level fatigue that persisted for weeks after the end. Young bodies absorbed and recovered from it more readily, which was another reason the work skewed young. The drive did not offer recovery time. It offered the next day. Personal hygiene on a cattle drive was managed within constraints that make almost any other working environment look luxurious by comparison. The primary washing opportunity was the river crossing. Men washed in the same rivers they were using to water 3,000 cattle, downstream from the cattle when possible, with whatever personal soap they had brought. Full bathing was an event, not a routine. Between crossings, the primary tool was a damp bandana or cloth moistened from the water barrel on the chuck wagon. The face, hands, and neck got attention. The rest waited for the next river. Shaving was similarly infrequent. Most cowboys went through 3 months with varying stages of beard growth. The trail towns at the end of the drive, Abilene, Dodge City, Ellsworth, did considerable barbershop business when cowboys with 3 months of pay and 3 months of beard arrived simultaneously. The standard cowboy outfit was designed for function: denim or canvas pants, flannel shirt, leather boots with a stirrup heel, broad-brimmed hat, leather chaps protecting the legs from brush and rope burns. Most cowboys wore essentially the same outfit for the duration of the drive: cleaning it when rivers permitted, and accepting its condition when they did not. Lice were a consistent companion. Infrequent bathing, shared bedrolls, and warm conditions created exactly the environment they preferred. The management of lice through picking, combing, and whatever preparations were available was a routine domestic task of trail life. The food of the cattle drive was, in its own way, one of the most interesting aspects of the enterprise, and the cook who produced it was, after the trail boss, arguably the most important person on the drive. The chuck wagon was an invention of Charles Goodnight, who in 1866 converted a surplus army wagon into a mobile kitchen by attaching a hinge cabinet that opened to form a work surface and organized storage for cooking equipment and food. The design was adopted across the industry almost immediately. It solved a genuine operational problem. How do you feed 12 men 3 meals a day while moving across several hundred miles of open country? The cook, called the cookie or sometimes the old man, was the most skilled and in many ways most powerful figure below the trail boss. His salary was typically higher than the Cowboys, reflecting the value of his function. All food preparation, supply management, setting up and breaking down camp twice daily, and maintaining the fire and water that made everything else possible. The cook's authority over the wagon, the fire, and the supply inventory was absolute. No cowboy touched the cook's equipment without permission. No cowboy complained about the food in the cook's presence. A cook who was antagonized could make the remaining weeks of a drive considerably worse, and everyone understood this. The food of the cattle drive was built around shelf-stable, high-calorie ingredients. Dried beans were the cornerstone, cooked overnight in the Dutch oven, available at every meal, the primary protein source for most of the drive. Beef was abundant in principle, but required specific circumstances to slaughter a marketable animal. Trail-worn cattle, animals injured in a crossing, cattle that could not keep pace. These became food. The paradox of being surrounded by beef while subsisting largely on beans was a genuine feature of cattle drive life. The biscuit was the bread of the drive: flour, lard, baking powder, and water baked in a Dutch oven buried in coals. Good biscuits were a genuine craft, valued accordingly. Bad biscuits were an operational morale problem. Coffee was not optional. It was a functional requirement of men working the hours that cattle drive work demanded. The pot stayed near the fire at all times, refilled continuously, consumed throughout the day and during the night watches. Made by boiling ground coffee directly in water, it produced a powerful and bitter brew that suited the purposes of keeping people alert through the night herd rotation. Sourdough was another staple. Cooks maintained a sourdough starter, a living yeast culture carried in a covered container and fed with flour and water throughout the drive, that served as leavening for bread and pancakes. The starter was a prized possession passed between cooks, and its loss to contamination or flooding was a genuine operational setback. Dried fruits, molasses, and salt pork provided variety where beef was unavailable. The chuck wagon larder was planned before departure and managed carefully throughout. There was no resupply until the end of the trail. Meals were served at the wagon. Cowboys ate standing or seated on the ground using tin plates from their own kit, served from Dutch ovens by the cook. Mealtime was one of the few genuine rest periods. Men spread across a mile of trail in near isolation came together for food and the specific conversation that work-exhausted men share. Practical, laconic, occasionally funny, maintaining the social cohesion that kept 12 individuals functioning as a crew. The hierarchy of the drive was real, but was a working hierarchy of competence, not a status. A trail boss who could not manage cattle and crew did not remain one. A cook who could not feed 12 working men did not remain one. The cattle drive was ruthlessly meritocratic in the ways that mattered. The end of the trail drive was a well-documented psychological event. 3 months of accumulated physical demand, social restraint, and deferred pleasure discharged into whatever the trail town offered. Trail towns offered a great deal and charged accordingly. The saloons, dance halls, barbershops, hotels, and restaurants understood their clientele and priced to extract a significant portion of 3 months' wages. The legendary wildness of Abilene and Dodge City was real, though its romantic dimension has been inflated. Men who had worked hard under difficult conditions and were now holding 3 months' pay had a predictable appetite for what work and discipline had denied them. And then the Cowboys went back to Texas, to another drive, or to ranching work in the off-season. Some left the cattle trade after one drive. Some made it their life's work. The railroads were coming closer to Texas cattle country with each passing year. The open range was being fenced. The drives were coming to an end, replaced by more efficient and less romantic means of getting beef to market. The last major cattle drives ran in the early 1890s. The era lasted less than 30 years. In that time, it moved enough cattle to shape the American food economy for generations and produced images and stories that have lasted far longer than the drives themselves. The cowboys sleeping on the ground in the rain, eating beans and biscuits, 3 months from the nearest bath, singing to 3,000 cattle in the dark to keep them from running. That cowboy was real. Not romantic by inclination. Practical because the work demanded it. Tough because the conditions required it. Young because the work wore older bodies out faster. And doing what working people have always done. Finding within the specific constraints of the work available a life that was his own, shaped by the land and the animals and the men around him into something that, looking back, appears to be adventure, but that, living through it, was simply the job. If this video gave you something worth knowing, please like it and share it with someone who would find it fascinating. Subscribe for more honest, detailed explorations of how people have actually lived and worked throughout history. See you in the next one.